The day felt ordinary, almost forgettable, which is why Margaret Collins did not sense that anything important was about to happen. The house was alive with simple noise, chairs moving, plates touching, people talking over one another in a way that meant comfort, not chaos. It was a Sunday afternoon in a quiet American suburb, the kind of day Margaret had lived 100 times before. Her son Ethan had invited a few friends over after lunch, and Margaret was used to seeing young faces come and go. She moved through the kitchen calmly, wiping the counter, listening without really hearing. Since her husband's passing years ago, she had learned how to exist in moments without fully stepping into them. She was present, kind, steady, but guarded. As she reached for a glass to place it on the drying rack, a voice spoke her name softly, not loud enough for the others to notice. Mrs. Collins. She turned and saw Daniel Harper standing a short distance away. Daniel was Ethan's closest friend, someone Margaret had known since he was barely out of high school. He had always been polite, thoughtful, the kind of young man parents trusted easily. But now there was something different in his posture. He wasn't relaxed. His hands were held together, his shoulders tense, as if he were holding something heavy inside his chest. "Could we talk alone?" he asked, carefully, almost nervously. "Just for a minute." The request caught her off guard. It wasn't strange on the surface. People asked to talk all the time, but the way he said it made her pause. Margaret looked past him toward the living room, where Ethan was laughing loudly, unaware of anything beyond the joke being told. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Sure," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Let's step outside." They walked through the back door onto the porch, and as soon as it closed behind them, the noise from inside faded into a distant hum. The quiet felt sudden and deep. The late afternoon light rested gently on the wooden floor, and a soft breeze moved through the air. Margaret sat down slowly, noticing how Daniel remained standing for a second longer, as if unsure where to place himself. When he finally sat across from her, he looked down instead of meeting her eyes. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Margaret had learned through years of life that silence often came before truth. "You don't have to be nervous," she said gently. What permission settled where they pleased, and demanded to be acknowledged. Daniel watched her closely, as if bracing for rejection, anger, or disappointment. But none of those came. Instead, Margaret felt a deep sense of sadness, not because of what he felt, but because she understood it. She had once loved deeply. She had once believed that part of her life was finished. Sitting there, facing a truth she never expected to hear, she realized how wrong that belief might have been. Still, she stayed quiet, letting him finish. "I needed you to know," Daniel said. "Not so you'd feel anything. Just so it wouldn't stay hidden." The words settled between them, fragile but sincere. Margaret inhaled slowly, choosing her response with care. She saw not a reckless young man, but someone trying to do the right thing in the only way he knew how. The porch remained quiet, the afternoon light unchanged, but something invisible had shifted. This was no longer just a Sunday gathering. It was the beginning of a moment neither of them would forget, a moment that would stay with Margaret long after the voices inside the house returned, long after the door opened again, and long after life tried to go back to the way it was before. After that quiet talk on the porch, life did not stop, but it no longer felt the same to Margaret Collins. She returned inside with Daniel a few moments later, both of them wearing calm expressions that hid the weight of what had been shared. Ethan noticed nothing, which was both a relief and a strange kind of ache. That evening, after the guests left and the house settled into silence, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Daniel's words replayed in her mind, not loudly, but steadily, like a clock she could not turn off. She told herself that nothing had truly changed, yet she felt a quiet shift inside her, as if a door she believed was locked had moved slightly open. In the days that followed, Daniel kept his distance without being cold, showing a care that was thoughtful but restrained. He spoke kindly, never crossing a line, yet every interaction carried an awareness that had not been there before. Margaret noticed how careful he was with his words, how he never stayed too long, how his eyes searched her face briefly before looking away. She tried to focus on her routines, work, errands, dinners with her children, but moments of stillness brought her back to him. She reminded herself that she was a mother first, a woman who had already lived through love and loss, and that some feelings, even when gentle, could not be invited further into her life. Still, she could not deny the warmth that had returned to parts of her heart she thought were finished. One afternoon, she found herself smiling at a memory of Daniel helping her fix a broken shelf months earlier, laughing awkwardly when it leaned the wrong way, and the realization startled her. She had not allowed herself to linger on such memories before. That night, sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was light and restless. Margaret understood then that the hardest part was not what Daniel felt, but what his honesty had awakened in her. She had lived carefully since her husband's death, choosing stability over risk, silence over vulnerability, and now she faced something she had avoided for years, the truth that she was still capable of longing. Days turned into weeks, and the space between her and Daniel grew quiet, but meaningful. They exchanged polite words, brief smiles, and shared glances that carried understanding rather than expectation. Margaret respected him for his restraint, and that respect deepened her feelings in ways she did not want to encourage. She thought often about Ethan, about trust, about how easily love could turn into hurt if handled without care. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave after a short visit, he paused at the door and looked at her with a seriousness that made her chest tighten. "Thank you," he said softly, "for hearing me and for not making me feel ashamed." Margaret nodded, holding herself steady. "Some feelings don't need to be acted on to be real," she replied. Daniel offered a small, grateful smile before stepping into the night. As the door closed behind him, Margaret leaned against the counter, realizing that the quiet she had built her life around was no longer empty. It was full of questions, restraint, and a tenderness that hurt precisely because it was unspoken, leaving her to wonder how long dignity could protect them both from the truth they now carried. Time moved forward, but for Margaret Collins it felt uneven, as if some days rushed past while others refused to move at all. After Daniel's quiet gratitude at the door, his presence in her life became lighter yet heavier at the same time. He visited less often, always with a clear reason, never staying longer than needed. Margaret told herself this was for the best, yet every time she heard his name, her attention sharpened without permission. She returned to her routines with effort, waking early, focusing on work, filling her evenings with small tasks, to avoid long moments of thought. Still, at night, when the house was silent and the lights were low, her thoughts drifted back to Daniel, not to anything improper, but to the calm understanding they shared, the way he had looked at her with respect rather than desire, as if he cared more about her peace than his own feelings. That understanding touched her deeply. She realized how lonely she had been without fully admitting it to herself. Widowhood had taught her strength, but it had also taught her how to hide parts of her heart. Now those parts felt awake, and that awareness frightened her. She questioned herself constantly, reminding herself of boundaries, of her role as a mother, of the responsibility she carried toward her son's trust. Yet feelings did not respond to logic alone. They existed quietly, asking only to be acknowledged. Margaret noticed how Daniel seemed older somehow, more thoughtful, carrying himself with a careful distance that spoke of self-control. When they did cross paths, their conversations were brief but meaningful, filled with pauses that said more than words ever could. She sensed that he, too, was struggling, choosing restraint again and again. That shared restraint created a bond that was invisible but strong. One evening, as Margaret sorted through old photographs, she paused on an image of herself, emotion with grace. The longing did not disappear, but it softened, turning into something calmer and wiser, and Margaret realized that sometimes the deepest growth comes not from what we pursue, but from what we choose to protect. Spring arrived quietly, and with it came a sense of decision that Margaret Collins could no longer delay. The days grew brighter, the air lighter, yet inside her, everything felt clear in a way it had not before. The weeks of silence, reflection, and careful distance had done their work. Margaret no longer felt confused by her emotions, she understood them. They were real, meaningful, and still not meant to be acted upon. She had accepted that truth without bitterness. One morning, while drinking coffee by the window, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children wait for school buses, she realized she felt peaceful. The ache was still there, but it no longer controlled her. Daniel remained part of their lives, though in a quieter way. He visited on special occasions, always respectful, always measured. Ethan trusted him completely, and that trust mattered more to Margaret than anything else. One afternoon, she invited Daniel to sit with her in the garden, the same place where she often thought things through. There was no tension this time, only honesty. She spoke first, her voice steady, telling him how much his maturity and respect had meant to her, how his honesty had reminded her that life did not end with loss, but changed shape. Daniel listened carefully, his expression calm but emotional. He told her he had grown from the experience too, that learning to step back had taught him patience and self-respect. They spoke openly, not about what could have been, but about what mattered now. Margaret made it clear that her role as a mother, and her desire to protect peace in her family, would always guide her choices. Daniel agreed without hesitation. There was no argument, no sadness filled with regret, only understanding. When they stood to part, they shared a quiet moment that held gratitude rather than longing. Time moved forward after that conversation, with a gentle certainty. Margaret focused more on herself, reconnecting with friends, rediscovering hobbies she had set aside, and allowing joy to return in simple ways. She no longer felt defined by her past or limited by fear of the future. Daniel eventually began a new chapter of his own life, one that Margaret supported from a distance with genuine happiness for him. Their connection settled into something calm and respectful, a shared chapter that had ended without damage. Years later, Margaret would look back on that season not as a mistake or a missed chance, but as a turning point. It had taught her that love did not always need to be claimed to be meaningful, that dignity could coexist with desire, and that sometimes the strongest choice was restraint. She learned that the heart could feel deeply without breaking, and that honoring boundaries could be an act of care rather than loss. On quiet evenings, she would sit in her garden and smile softly, grateful for the lesson that arrived disguised as temptation, but left behind wisdom. The day Daniel asked to talk alone did not lead to a dramatic ending or a hidden romance, but it gave Margaret something just as powerful, proof that she was still alive inside, still capable of connection and strong enough to choose what truly mattered.